You have to understand, Maya, this isn't a negotiation. The car will be here at 9 sharp, your bags are already in the trunk, and your father's signature is right next to mine. Legally, you're no longer fit to make your own decisions. Julian said this without even turning away from the mirror, his fingers deftly perfecting the knot of his $1,000 silk tie. I stood behind him, gripping the handle of my mahogany cane so hard the grain bit into my palm, staring at the 2 suitcases by the door that I hadn't packed. My husband, the man who swore to be my human crutch after the hit and run that shattered my inner ear and ended my career as a high-end architect, had just sold me out to the Gables, a high-security psych ward, just to clear the path for his promotion and a replacement wife who could actually walk a red carpet. The room tilted dangerously, but for the first time in 3 years, it wasn't the vertigo. It was the moment I realized that the next 24 hours would either be my final disappearance or the beginning of his absolute ruin. How did I let this master manipulator turn my own home into a cage and my own father into his silent accomplice? It all started exactly 1 month ago, when the perfect facade of the sterling marriage began to show the kind of microfractures I had spent years desperately ignoring. We lived in a glass and steel penthouse overlooking the city skyline, a masterpiece I had designed myself before a black SUV jumped the curb and turned my life into a blur of dizzying nausea and physical therapy. Julian was the saint of the local country club. He was the one who patiently sat through every rehab session, who picked out my sensible shoes, and who whispered every night that I was still the most brilliant woman he'd ever met. My father, Marcus, a retired judge who valued legacy above all else, practically worshipped Julian. "You're lucky, Maya," he'd tell me over Sunday scotch. "Most men would have checked out after the accident, but Julian, he carries your whole world on his shoulders." I believed him. I leaned into that luck until it became a prison, unaware that the shoulders I was leaning on were already shrugging me off. The suspicion didn't start with a scream. It started with a line item. I was looking for a tax file in Julian's leather briefcase when I found a folder labeled Future Planning. Inside wasn't a retirement fund or a new investment. It was a series of invoices for a long-term residential suite at the Gables, a place known for housing the wealthy who have become inconvenient. The first deposit was made the same day Julian was shortlisted for managing partner at his firm. My heart did a slow, sickening roll in my chest. "Maybe it's for his mother," I whispered to the empty office, my hands shaking so hard I had to lean against the desk. "She's been struggling." I tucked the folder back and forced myself to breathe, but that night I started watching him. I noticed the way he looked at me when he thought I was focused on my sketches. It wasn't the gaze of a concerned husband, it was the cold, clinical look of a CEO evaluating a depreciating asset that needed to be liquidated before the fiscal year ended. 3 days later, the cracks became a canyon. I decided to surprise Julian at his office. It was the first time I had ventured out into the city alone without his protection in 6 months. As I navigated the marble hallway, the rhythmic thump-click of my cane muffled by the thick carpet, I heard voices coming from his partially open door. He was talking to my father. "Marcus, I can't hide it anymore." Julian's voice broke with a practiced, hollow sorrow that made my skin crawl. "She's becoming a danger to herself. Last night she was wandering near the balcony again, talking to people who aren't there. The doctors say the brain trauma is finally taking its toll. It's early onset dementia, accelerated by the accident." I froze, the world spinning into a gray haze. My father's voice was heavy with a terrible, misplaced pity. "My poor girl. If you're sure the house isn't safe for her anymore, Julian, do what you have to do. I'll sign the guardianship papers if it means she gets the specialized care she needs." Julian wasn't just moving me. He was systematically gaslighting the only person I had left to ensure I'd be locked away without a fight. I retreated before they could see me, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every step back to the elevator felt like an eternity. He had been planting the seeds for months, telling friends I was unstable, telling the neighbors I was prone to episodes, all while playing the grieving, stoic caretaker to perfection. I needed a witness, someone who still saw the architect and not the victim. I called Sarah, my former lead designer and the only person Julian hadn't managed to alienate from me. We met at a nondescript diner on the edge of town. Sarah took one look at the invoices I'd photographed and turned pale. Maya, it's worse than you think. Julian's been seen at the club with the daughter of the firm's biggest client. He's telling everyone you're in a catatonic state most days. He's already replaced you in the narrative. All he needs now is to physically remove you from the house so he can move her in. Driving home, the fear finally crystallized into a cold, predatory focus. Julian thought I was a broken doll he could just toss into a bin because I couldn't walk a straight line anymore. He forgot that I spent a decade calculating structural loads and finding the exact point where a building would collapse under pressure. He wanted a game of madness. I would give him a performance that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I entered the penthouse to find him waiting with a glass of wine and those 2 packed suitcases. "You need your rest, honey," he said, his eyes filled with a triumphant shimmer. "Everything changes tomorrow." "Oh, you're right, Julian. Tomorrow everything changes, but not according to your blueprints." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark of the living room, listening to his rhythmic, unsuspecting breathing from the master suite, and I began to design the demolition of Julian Sterling. Part 2. The Trap. The sun rose over the skyline like a spotlight on a crime scene. Julian was already in the kitchen, humming a tune as he brewed artisanal coffee, looking every bit the grieving but doing what's best husband. He hadn't noticed that I'd spent the night moving like a ghost through our home, collecting every piece of jewelry, every hard drive, and every legal document I could find. I walked into the kitchen, my cane steady, my face a mask of fragile compliance. "You're up early," he said, sliding a cup toward me. "The car will be here in an hour. I've spoken to the director at the Gables. They have a garden, Maya. You'll love it." I took a sip of the coffee, bitter like everything else in this house, and looked him straight in the eyes. "I'm sure I will, Julian. I just want peace." I saw the flicker of relief in his gaze. He thought the gaslighting had finally worked, that I was too exhausted to fight. He didn't realize that peace for me meant seeing him lose everything he had spent his life building. As Julian went to the bedroom to grab his briefcase, I made my move. I hadn't just sat in the dark last night. I'd made a phone call to a contact I hadn't spoken to since before the accident, a high-stakes private investigator who specialized in unorthodox corporate disputes. When the black car pulled up to the curb at 9 a.m., Julian escorted me down with a hand on my elbow that felt like a shackle. "I'll follow in my car," he whispered for the benefit of the driver. "I love you, Maya." I didn't answer. I just climbed into the back seat of the town car. But we weren't going to the Gables. I'd spent the last of my liquid cash to ensure the driver was working for me, not the facility. As the car pulled away, I watched Julian's reflection in the side mirror. He was already on his phone, likely calling his replacement to tell her the coast was clear. He thought the liability was gone. He had no idea I was just repositioning myself. Instead of the facility, the driver took me to a secure hotel downtown, where Sarah and the investigator, a man named Elias, were waiting. "You have 6 hours before he realizes you never checked in," Elias said, laying out a series of folders on the table. "He's been careful, Maya. The guardianship papers your father signed are ironclad if we don't prove fraud, but I found something Julian didn't expect anyone to look for." He slid a photo across the table. It was a shot of Julian meeting with a man in a parking garage, a man I recognized as the city's lead building inspector. My architect's brain clicked into gear. Julian wasn't just getting rid of me for a new wife, he was covering up a massive structural flaw in the waterfront project, the firm's biggest contract. He knew I'd noticed the discrepancies in the blueprints months ago, and he'd used my accident as the perfect excuse to tell the firm I was confused and unreliable so he could sign off on the faulty plans himself. "He's using the firm's money to pay for the Gables," Sarah added, her voice trembling with indignation. "He's embezzling under the guise of your medical expenses." I looked at the evidence, the fake invoices, the forged signatures, the photos of him with the inspector. This wasn't just a divorce, it was a criminal conspiracy, but the blow that hurt the most came next. Elias pulled out a final document. It was a life insurance policy, recently updated. If I were to have an accident while under the specialized care of the Gables, Julian would receive a payout of $5 million. He wasn't just hiding me, he was waiting for the right moment to finish what that SUV had started 3 years ago. I felt the vertigo return, but I gripped the edge of the table and forced the world to stay still. I wasn't going to hide. I was going to use his own greed as the foundation for his prison. I spent the next 4 hours recording a series of videos. In the first, I was the fragile Maya, sounding confused and scared, just like the woman Julian had described to everyone. In the second, I was the architect, sharp and clinical, explaining the structural failures in the waterfront project and showing the proof of Julian's forgeries. "We need to leak this to the firm's board," Sarah said, reaching for the laptop. I shook my head, a cold smile spreading across my face. "No, the board will try to bury it to save the company's reputation. We're going to give this to the one person Julian fears more than the law." I picked up the phone and dialed my father's private line. He picked up on the second ring, his voice weary. "Julian, is she settled in?" I took a deep breath, pitching my voice to sound like a ghost. "Dad, it's me. I'm not at the facility. Julian tried to kill me, Dad, and he used you to do it." The silence on the other end was deafening. I could hear my father's breathing hitch, the sound of a man who had spent 30 years on the bench, realizing he'd been played by a common criminal. "Maya, where are you? What are you talking about?" I told him everything, the embezzlement, the insurance policy, the blueprints, but I didn't ask him to call the police. "If you call the cops now, he'll have his lawyers spin it before the sun sets," I whispered. "I need you to do what you do best, Judge. I need you to invite him to dinner tonight to celebrate the promotion. Tell him I'm resting comfortably. Tell him you're proud of him. And make sure he brings his briefcase." As I hung up, Elias looked at me with a newfound respect. "And what are you going to be doing?" he asked. I looked at my cane, then at the blueprints on the table. "I'm going back to the penthouse," I said. "I'm going to set a trap in the one place he thinks he's king." I arrived at the penthouse an hour before Julian was due back from his celebratory meeting. I used my spare key, the one he thought he'd taken, and entered the quiet, cold space. I didn't take anything. Instead, I left things. I left a copy of the structural report on his pillow. I left the insurance policy on the dining table, and I hid a small, high-definition camera in the eye of the designer clock on the mantel. Then I went to the balcony. I stood right where he told my father I'd been wandering, looking out at the city that had once been mine. When I heard the front door open, my heart didn't race. It turned to ice. Julian walked in, whistling, his jacket thrown over his shoulder. He stopped dead when he saw the documents on the table. He stopped breathing when he saw me standing by the glass door. "Maya?" he gasped, his face draining of color. "How? You're supposed to be at the facility." I turned around, leaning on my cane, and gave him the most beautiful smile I'd ever practiced. "The facility had a structural failure, Julian. Just like your waterfront project. We should talk." Julian's eyes darted around the room, his mind clearly racing for a lie, a pivot, a way to regain control. He took a step toward me, his hands shaking. "You've had an episode, honey. You're not thinking straight. Let me call the doctor." He reached for his phone, but I held up a remote. "I wouldn't do that, Julian. Everything you're about to say is being streamed live to your firm's board of directors and my father." He froze, his hand hovering over his pocket. The mask of the saint finally crumbled, revealing the predator beneath. "You think you're smart?" he sneered, his voice dropping an octave. "You're a cripple who can't even walk across a room without a stick. Who do you think they're going to believe? The man who built this city or the woman who can't even keep her head on straight?" He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. "I should have made sure you didn't get up from that pavement 3 years ago." My heart stopped. He hadn't just used the accident. He was the one who drove the SUV. The air in the penthouse vanished. The confession didn't come as a shout. It was a low, jagged hiss that hung between us like poison. Julian didn't look horrified by what he'd just admitted. He looked relieved to finally stop pretending. "That's right, Maya," he whispered, taking another step, his polished shoes clicking on the hardwood I had chosen for us. The SUV? That was just business. You were going to report those structural flaws to the city. You were going to ruin the firm's reputation before I could take my seat at the table. I thought the impact would end it, but you're like a weed, aren't you? You just kept growing back, getting in the way. I gripped my cane, my knuckles white, the floor beneath me feeling like a ship in a storm. My own husband had tried to kill me 3 years ago, then spent every day since pretending to be my savior while slowly poisoning my mind. It was a level of depravity that made the vertigo feel like a mercy. "You're a monster," I breathed, my voice trembling not with fear, but with a cold, concentrated rage. Julian laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "I'm a pragmatist, Maya, and right now the pragmatic thing is to finish what I started. You think a live stream is going to save you? By the time the police get here, you'll have had another episode. A tragic fall from the balcony of the penthouse you designed. A broken woman finally succumbing to the weight of her own mind. Your father will be devastated, of course, but he's already signed the papers saying you're unstable. I've spent months making sure no one would doubt my version of the story." He was only 5 feet away now, his eyes fixed on the glass door behind me. He wasn't seeing his wife, he was seeing a loose end that needed to be tied. But Julian had made one fatal mistake. He assumed that because my body was broken, my mind was too. He didn't know that I had spent the afternoon with Elias, not just recording videos, but rerouting the penthouse's smart home security system. As he lunged forward, his hands reaching for my throat, I didn't scream. I pressed the button on the small remote hidden in my pocket. Suddenly, the lights in the apartment flared to a blinding intensity, and the heavy automated shutters on the balcony doors slammed shut with a metallic bang, trapping him in the center of the room. From the hidden speakers in the ceiling, his own voice began to play. The confession he had just made, looped and amplified until the walls seemed to shake with his words. "I should have made sure you didn't get up from that pavement." Julian froze, his face contorting in a mixture of confusion and terror. He spun around, looking at the ceiling, then back at me. "Turn it off," he roared, but I was already moving, not away from him, but toward the dining table. I leaned heavily on my cane, every step a calculated effort of will. "It's not just a live stream, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the recording of his own malice. "It's an archive, and it's not just going to the board, it's going to the district attorney. My father isn't at a restaurant waiting for you. He's in the lobby downstairs with the police. He's been listening to every word since you walked through that door." The color drained from Julian's face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. He lunged for the shutters, clawing at the reinforced glass, but they were locked tight. The saint was finally in a cage of his own making. The front door burst open, the sound of heavy boots echoing in the hallway. I expected to see the police, but the first person through the door was my father. His face wasn't that of the judge I knew. It was the face of a man who had just watched his soul be dismantled. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at me, his eyes brimming with a shame so deep it was visceral. Behind him, 3 officers moved in, their weapons drawn. Julian didn't fight. He collapsed onto the sofa, the same sofa where he used to hold me and tell me everything would be okay, and buried his face in his hands. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the sound was the most beautiful melody I had heard in 3 years. "Maya," my father whispered, stepping toward me, his hand reaching out. I took a half step back, the mahogany handle of my cane the only thing keeping me upright. "Don't, Dad," I said, my voice flat. "You signed those papers. You believed him over your own daughter." The officers led Julian away, but he stopped at the door, turning back to look at me one last time. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a bitter, burning resentment. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You're still a cripple, Maya. You're still broken, and now you're alone. Let's see how long your strength lasts when there's no one left to carry you." The door slammed shut, leaving the apartment in a deafening silence. My father stood in the center of the room, the weight of his betrayal slumped in his shoulders. "I'll make this right, Maya. I'll hire the best lawyers. I cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You can't make this right, Dad. You let him convince you I was a burden. You wanted the easy version of me, the one you didn't have to worry about. Well, this is the version you're left with." I walked, slowly, painfully, to the large drafting table in the corner of the room, the one I hadn't touched since the accident. I pulled back the dusty sheet, revealing the blueprints for a project I had started long ago, a center for independent living, designed for people like me, by someone like me. I picked up a pencil, the weight of it familiar and grounding. "I'm not alone," I said, looking at the city lights through the gaps in the shutters. "I have the one thing Julian could never take, no matter how hard he hit me." I looked at my father, my gaze unwavering. "I have the truth, and tomorrow I'm going to start building something that doesn't need your protection." But as the adrenaline began to fade, a sharp pain flared in my chest. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope I had found in Julian's briefcase earlier. I hadn't opened it yet. It was addressed to me in Julian's handwriting, dated the day of the accident. With shaking hands, I tore it open, and the world tilted one more time. The paper was yellowed at the edges, a relic from the day my life shattered. As I unfolded it, Julian's elegant, practiced script blurred before my eyes. It wasn't a confession, and it wasn't a suicide note. It was a contract, a private agreement between Julian and my father, dated 3 years ago. My breath hitched as I read the terms. In exchange for Julian taking me off his hands and managing my permanent care without dragging the family name through a public trial or a messy disability suit, my father had agreed to bankroll Julian's partnership buy-in. I stared at the signature at the bottom. Marcus Sterling. My father hadn't just been fooled. He had been the architect of my containment from the very beginning. He didn't just sign the guardianship papers last week. He had sold my autonomy years ago to keep his life uncomplicated. The room didn't just spin this time. It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me, leaving me suspended in a void of total betrayal. I looked up at my father, who was still standing by the door, trying to look like the grieving protector. I held up the paper, my hand trembling so violently that the page rattled like dry leaves. "You sold me," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "The accident. You knew. You knew it was him, or at least you suspected, and you used it as leverage to buy my silence before I even knew I'd been silenced." My father's face didn't crumble into guilt. It hardened into that familiar judicial mask of necessary evils. He took a step toward me, reaching out a hand that I now saw as a claw. "Maya, you were broken. The doctor said you'd never be the same. I was protecting the family's standing. Julian was a rising star, and you were going to be a tragedy. I made sure you were taken care of." I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You didn't protect me. You protected your scotch, your golf club memberships, and your pride. You traded your daughter for a quiet life." I didn't wait for his rebuttal. I grabbed my cane and moved toward the door, my movements jerky and fueled by a raw, teeing adrenaline. "Get out," I said, my voice rising to a cold, steady command. "Get out of my house. Get out of my life. If I ever see you again, I'll release this contract to every news outlet in the state. Let's see how your standing holds up when the world knows you sold your paralyzed daughter to her attempted murderer." My father opened his mouth to speak, but the look in my eyes must have been lethal, because he shut it, straightened his coat, and walked out without another word. I slammed the door and locked it, leaning my forehead against the cool wood, listening to the silence of a life that had been a total lie. I was alone in a glass tomb, surrounded by the ghosts of a marriage that was a crime and a fatherhood that was a business deal. I spent the next 48 hours in a trance of productivity. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the black SUV's headlights. I contacted Elias and Sarah, moving my operation to a secure workspace Sarah owned. We worked through the night, tracing the money. It turned out Julian hadn't just been embezzling for my care, he had been funneling money into a series of offshore accounts linked to the contractor of the waterfront project. They were cutting corners on the foundation, using substandard concrete that would eventually crack under the weight of the tides. If that building went up, it wouldn't just be a financial disaster, it would be a death trap. "We have enough to bury them both," Sarah said, rubbing her tired eyes as the sun began to peek through the blinds. "But Julian's lawyers are already filing for a bail hearing. They're claiming the live stream was a deep fake or a staged performance by an unstable woman." I looked at the blueprints spread out across the table. I wasn't the same woman who had entered that penthouse 3 years ago. That woman was dead, buried under Julian's lies and my father's greed. The woman standing here was forged in fire and betrayal. Let them file, I said, my voice sounding foreign even to me. I want him out on bail. I want him to think he's winning. Sarah looked at me, worried. Maya, what are you planning? If he gets out, he'll come for you. He has nothing left to lose. I traced the line of the faulty foundation on the map. He thinks I'm the liability. He thinks I'm the weak point in the structure. He's about to find out that when you build a lie on a faulty foundation, the whole thing comes down with a single touch. I reached for my phone and made one last call to the daughter of the firm's biggest client, the woman Julian had been grooming to be my replacement. Meeting Chloe was like looking into a mirror of my past self, young, ambitious, and utterly blinded by Julian's saintly aura. We met in a crowded park where Julian's associates wouldn't be lurking. She looked at my cane with that same pitying expression I'd seen 1,000 times. I don't know why I'm here, Maya, she said, her voice defensive. Julian told me you were unwell. He said you were obsessed with destroying him. I didn't say a word. I simply handed her a tablet and hit play on a video Elias had recovered from the penthouse's internal server, footage Julian thought he'd deleted. It wasn't the confession. It was a video of Julian and the contractor laughing as they looked at the faulty blueprints, with Julian saying, "By the time the cracks show, I'll be managing partner and Maya will be long gone. It's a win-win." Chloe's face went through a dozen emotions in 10 seconds. Shock, disbelief, and finally, a cold, sharp realization. He was going to do the same thing to me, wasn't he? She whispered. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a shield. By the end of the week, the trap was set. Julian was released on bail, just as I'd hoped. He retreated to a private estate he'd bought with the embezzled funds, thinking he could lay low until his lawyers scrubbed the live stream from the public record. He thought he had silenced me. He thought Chloe was still his loyal backup. He was waiting for the storm to blow over, unaware that I was the storm. I sat in Sarah's office, watching the GPS tracker Elias had planted on Julian's car. He was moving toward the waterfront project site, likely to meet the contractor and destroy any remaining physical evidence of the concrete swaps. He's taking the bait, Elias said, checking his watch. He thinks he's going to burn the evidence tonight. I stood up, grabbing my cane. It wasn't a support anymore. It was a scepter. Let's go, I said. It's time for the final inspection. We arrived at the construction site under the cover of a moonless night. The skeletal frame of the building loomed over the water like a rib cage. I could see the glow of a flashlight in the basement level, the heart of the faulty foundation. I left Sarah and Elias with the police units waiting just outside the perimeter. I have to do this part alone, I told them. He needs to see me. I navigated the uneven ground of the site, my vertigo screaming at me as the wind whipped off the water, but I didn't stumble. I walked into the damp, cold basement and found Julian pouring gasoline over a stack of original logbooks. He spun around, the lighter in his hand flickering. "You just don't know when to stay dead, do you?" He snarled, his eyes wild. "You came here to watch me burn it all? Fine, you can stay for the fire." He stepped toward me, but I didn't back away. I leaned on my cane and pointed to the pillar behind him. "You're standing on the crack, Julian. Can you feel it?" Part 5. The Price. Julian froze, the lighter's flame dancing in his pupils. He looked down instinctively at the concrete beneath his feet, then back at me with a jagged, desperate laugh. "Nice try, Maya. I designed this foundation. I know exactly how much it can take. It'll hold long enough for me to erase you and this paper trail." He flicked the lighter, the small spark appearing monstrous in the cavernous dark. The narrative is already shifting. The unstable wife tries to burn down her husband's legacy in a fit of jealous rage. It's a classic. He took a step toward the gasoline-soaked logs, but his foot caught on a piece of rebar. He stumbled, and in that moment of weakness, I saw him for what he truly was. Not a mastermind, but a small, terrified man trying to outrun the gravity of his own lies. "You didn't design this foundation, Julian." "I did," I said, my voice echoing off the raw concrete walls. "I designed the original specs 3 years ago. You just tweaked them to save a few million, but you forgot one thing about the way I build. I gestured with my cane to the sensors I'd had Elias install an hour earlier, small, blinking lights embedded in the support pillars. I build for resilience, and I build for accountability. Those sensors aren't just measuring stress, they're streaming the chemical composition of this concrete to the state inspector's office in real time. The moment you light that fire, the heat will trigger a structural alarm that can't be overridden. You won't be burning evidence. You'll be signaling your own execution. Julian's face twisted. He lunged at me, his fingers clawing for the remote in my hand, but I didn't flinch. I let him come close enough to see the lack of fear in my eyes. Go ahead, Julian, finish it. But know that my father is already in custody for the contract he signed with you. He traded his daughter for a career, and I just traded his freedom for the truth. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The lighter slipped from his hand, clattering onto the dry patch of concrete just inches from the gasoline. He looked at me, his mouth agape, the realization dawning that he was trapped in a structure of his own greed. You destroyed your own father? He whispered. I looked at the mahogany handle of my cane, the wood worn smooth by my struggle. He destroyed himself the day he put a price tag on my life. I'm just the one collecting the debt. Outside, the sudden wail of sirens cut through the salt air, blue and red lights strobing against the skeletal ribs of the building. Julian scrambled toward the back exit, but Chloe stepped out from the shadows of the utility stairwell, her phone held high, recording every frantic second of his retreat. He was surrounded by the very people he thought he had successfully erased. The aftermath was a blur of depositions, structural hearings, and the slow, agonizing collapse of the Sterling Whitman legacy. Julian was denied bail after the evidence of the life insurance policy and the hit-and-run surfaced. He's currently serving 25 years for attempted murder and massive corporate fraud. My father, Marcus, avoided a long prison sentence due to his age and a plea deal, but he lost everything else: his title, his reputation, and the daughter he thought he could manage like a portfolio. He sends me letters from his small, rented apartment, begging for a meeting, for one last chance to explain. I leave them unopened in the back of my desk, right next to the brochures for the Gables. I don't need his explanations. I finally have my own voice. I moved out of the penthouse. I sold it and used the proceeds to fund the Sterling Center, not named after Julian, but after the woman who survived him. It's a facility that teaches independent living and provides legal advocacy for people with disabilities who have been victims of domestic and financial abuse. I still use my cane, and the world still tilts on occasion, but I've learned to find my balance in the movement. I'm back at my drafting table now, designing a world that doesn't rely on saints or protectors. Sarah is my partner, and Elias handles our security. I am no longer a liability, I am the foundation, but there is a price to every victory. Last night, I received a package. It was a single, small mahogany box. Inside was the ring Julian had thrown on the floor the night this all began, along with a note from his lawyer. Julian had requested it be returned to me with a message. You think you're free, Maya, but you're still living in the house I built. Every time you limp, you'll remember me. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. He was right about one thing. The memory of the betrayal is a permanent fixture in my architecture. I took the ring and walked to the balcony, the wind cold against my face. I looked down at the dark water below and realized that the hardest part of moving on isn't the physical pain. It's the knowledge that I had to become a predator to survive one. I dropped the ring into the abyss and watched it disappear. I am free, but I am not the woman I used to be. I am something harder, colder, and much more dangerous. I survived the man I loved, but I had to kill the heart that loved him to do it.